Welcome to this podcast of the Florida Historical Quarterly. My name is Connie Lester, and I'm the editor of the Florida Historical Quarterly. This podcast is the fourth in our series and represents 1 year of podcasting for the Quarterly. We would like to have feedback from our listeners about the podcasts and how we might improve future podcasts. Listeners may email their comments to flhisqtr@mail.ucf.edu. Today's podcast features an interview with Dr. Derrick White, who is an assistant professor at Florida Atlantic University. His article explores the use of Confederate symbols at Florida college football games during the 1960s. His article, From Desegregation to Integration, Race, Football, and Dixie at the University of Florida, examines the differences between desegregation as experienced by admitting black students on white campuses and integration as changing campus life to end racial culture and incorporate blacks fully into student activities. Support for Dr. White's research included the Julian Pleasance Visiting Scholar Award at the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program at the University of Florida. In addition to the featured article, the spring issue of Volume 88 contains articles by David Nelson and Thomas Hulse. Nelson's article, When Modern Tourism Was Born, Florida at the World Fairs and on the World Stage in the 1930s, situates Florida tourism within the efforts by Depression-era governors and the Florida Department of Agriculture to publicize the state and reinvigorate the economy. The image projected by the Florida exhibits at the 1930s fairs transformed the state into a year-round tourist destination. Funded by the Florida Department of Agriculture, the exhibits presented the state as, quote, devoid of class, race, unemployment lines, labor disputes, or foreign immigration, end quote. In other words, a place to get away from it all for every traveler. Thomas Hulse focuses on military construction in antebellum Pensacola in his article, Military Slave Rentals, the Construction of Army Fortifications, and the Navy Yard in Pensacola, Florida, 1824 to 1863. He argues that the construction of forts and shipyards as part of the coastal defense system encouraged the development of the local economy, including the purchase of slaves to rent to the military as construction laborers. Finally, the spring issue contains 15 book reviews, an index to Volume 88, and a bibliography of new scholarship on Florida history published during 2009. Dr. Robert Casanello, an assistant professor in history and a member of the Florida Historical Quarterly editorial board, interviewed Dr. White for this podcast. Please enjoy this discussion on race, football, and Dixie at the University of Florida.
Derrick, why don't you tell our listeners who you are?
My name is Derrick White, and I'm an assistant professor at Florida Atlantic University. Graduate of Ohio State University, PhD in 2004. I currently do African American history, sports history in the 20th century.
Okay, now you wrote an article in the spring 2010 issue of the Florida Historical Quarterly about the playing of Dixie at the university. At universities in the state of Florida during sports games and what that might mean during the course of the 1950s and 60s. And, one of the interesting things I think that you pointed out that I guess is the kernel of your piece is that there really is a difference between the term desegregation and integration. And if you can explain that just briefly to us, why is it that desegregation and integration, why aren't they the same thing? Why are they really two different concepts?
Well, one of the reasons that I try to emphasize the difference between desegregation and integration is that I think too often society has basically said that, well, these institutions are no longer segregated, therefore they're integrated. And I think that there's a middle step there, that desegregation represents the presence of minority students, faculty, staff, etc., At the same time, it does not mean that the university or an institution is fully integrated, meaning that you can have African Americans in positions as tokens, is the phrase that they would use in the 60s, 70s, and sometimes in the 80s as token representation to say that, look, here's our person or persons who demonstrate that we are no longer a segregated institution. And one of the things I was trying to imply in the article is that integration really means that you have to incorporate minorities in this sense into the life of the institution. And so at the university level, I try to emphasize that student culture is really the kind of the last bastion, to the last space at least to determine if integration has been fully accepted.
You know, and I think to build upon that, I mean, it's interesting that you really kind of had to draw yourself to the extracurricular activities to kind of test this, to say, okay, if the school is saying they're desegregated, but if we look at this extracurricular life, you know, we have a sort of different story than, you know, some of these other factors. Could you explain how you got drawn to the extracurricular life here?
Yeah, no, it was actually, I was fortunate enough to receive a grant to look at the oral history archives at the University of Florida. And one of the things I was interested in was athletic desegregation or athletic integration at Florida. And one of the things that was in the course of my studies, the players talked about their experience. I read the interviews from some of the first students. And what struck me, and I had heard this before, is that how many of these initial students, these initial black students, did not feel that they were welcome. They had this sense that they were at the university, but they were not really a part of the university. And that got me to thinking, okay, I've heard that story before. That's not unusual for the first generation of African-American students at Southern white institutions. But really what caught my eye is that when reading the student newspapers and looking for commentary about the first black students, there was first black athletes, there was very little commentary in the student newspaper about it. But there was a tremendous amount of commentary about whether or not it was right or justified that the university band continued to play Dixie at the sporting event. And to me, that was like far more interesting and really had never seen in print the discussion of the university bands in relationship to the desegregation process at the university. And so that got me to thinking of that as a vehicle talking about student culture on the university campuses in the South. And then, of course, my further research at the University of Miami provided me kind of a good counterbalance as a place where the president, Stanford, just basically ended playing Dixie in 1968, while Florida allowed it to continue and had this tremendous debate in the student newspaper over a course of a semester and a half.
Right. You know, and there's like two things that sort of came out to me as I read your article, and I want to, you know, tell you about them and let you respond to each one of them. And I guess I'll take the one first because you brought up the difference in when the University of Miami stopped playing Dixie versus the University of Florida. And one of the things that I found interesting throughout your piece was that, you know, if we sort of look at, if we take 1961, I guess, as a starting point here, you know, we end the era of Leroy Collins as governor in Florida, who tried to usher in kind of a new way of Florida as a southern state. Maybe, you know, some have gone so far as to call that like a Sunbelt state, you know. Mm-hmm. And it seems as if there's like almost like a sun that's rising, and maybe it starts in Miami and goes to UF, and eventually, you know, later on, as you described later on in the article, even, you know, the University of Mississippi and the University of South Carolina have to confront this Confederate iconography, you know, in their extracurricular activities, and it's sort of like a wave. It's not just like a one-time hits all, and I'm wondering, you know, how much, you know, what are the other factors that go into when and how a school decides to, you know, abandon this nostalgia for the Confederacy? I mean, is there, you know, like if I'm sure today in 2010, if you were to pull aside a University of Miami student, they would say, what, you know, the Confederacy at the University of Miami, you know, we probably have to speak Spanish, you know, to really kind of feel like we fit in here. And that would be such a remote idea, but of course, you know, it's part of the history, as you pointed out. So, I mean, what are the factors that, you know, sort of go into when and why these schools begin to just abandon these practices?
And that's a good question. I think of course, I think it varies. I mean, using the University of Miami, I think one of the things that was really interesting and clear is that they were able to make that decision in part because of the unique status of the University of Miami as far as a Southern institution. As an institution, it was founded, I believe, in 1926. And from its very beginning, it had recruited students not only from the Northeast, as it was known as Suntan U in the 1950s, but it also recruited a large number of students from the Caribbean, Central America, and South America. And so one of the things is that it never had that traditional Old South Confederacy feel about it, but they understood that their location in Miami or in Florida, that there's a certain kind of allure to, as you said, that iconography. And so I think it was much easier for them to at least address it head on, also being a very urban location in terms of its city. I think the further north you move from Miami north, I think each university had a much more difficult time to approach it. I think Gainesville, University of Florida's position in Gainesville, being in the more central, north central part of the state, had a more difficult time representing the entire state. And it also, I think you pointed out, reflects the changing demographics of the state of Florida. And so is Florida going to rely on this Old South, or is it going to be part of, as you said, the Sun Belt? As you move into the other states, Alabama and Georgia, into the kind of the heart of the Confederacy or the Black Belt, those schools were much more reluctant in getting rid of the kind of Confederacy as part of their football or sporting experience. Even the University of Alabama, as part of its threat against, in the sense of trying to resist desegregation, the state legislators ordered not only the college but the high schools to continue to play Dixie at college football games as well as high school football games. So it became kind of a point of resistance.
So it's almost like culturally the Sun Belt doesn't touch some places, but touches others.
Yeah, it doesn't quite touch some places as much as others. And then I think there's really a profound sense that by the time you get into the mid-70s, say 75, 76, when these southern institutions, let's take the SEC for example, are desegregated, there becomes a sense that is it okay for us to constantly have Dixie playing in the stands while at the same time we're trying to recruit these athletes? And I think one of the things, and if you investigate this kind of more closely, and I think you have to do it on a university by university case, is that these recruiting battles become very important to the success of football in this region. And players were leaving the South to go to Michigan State, to Notre Dame, to Syracuse, to UCLA, USC. And that really troubled coaches such as Paul Bear Bryant in the 1970s. And so I think there's a lot of sense that, what are the battles that you're willing to fight and willing to win? And how can you win those battles on the athletic field? And what kind of concessions do you need to make to do so? And so with the exception of South Carolina and Mississippi, the Georgias and even Alabamas of the world slowly, at least at the football game itself, begin to end this practice of playing Dixie.
Mm-hmm. So then the University of Mississippi and University of South Carolina just have to give up hopes of a national championship in return for being able to celebrate what they conceive as a tradition, almost.
Yeah, I mean, I was, in fact, and I was looking at earlier, looking at who won national titles since the AP held its polls. And really, the South was well represented in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and in the early 60s. But there's a dearth of wins after 1965. In fact, Alabama was the only team from the South to win in the 70s. They won in, I believe, 78 and 79. And then the University of Miami won in 1983 a national title. And to me, that really signals the end of that whole kind of, we can maintain our Southern way of life, recruit black athletes, and win football games. Because at that point in 1983, Howard Snellenberger had basically instituted what he called the state of Miami, where he began to basically recruit kids from South Florida only to really transform the football fortunes of the University of Miami.
Yeah. Okay. Now, the second thing I wanted to bring up that kind of struck me reading your piece was that in the popular imagination, when we, and I'm not saying maybe not you and I, but I think the average person on the street, if you tell them, can you create us, a timeline of desegregation or the civil rights movement, and most people probably would put Jackie Robinson and his time with the Brooklyn Dodgers, certainly before Brown v. Board, and say, oh, this was this early precursor, and sports was this way of a vanguard of civil rights, even before the school system and transportation and all these other places we've come to associate civil rights with. But your story sort of tells an invert to that and says, well, no, on the university campus, these sporting activities really represented, a back seat, where this tradition had a place to flourish, while the rest of the university was dealing with, the civil rights issues and desegregation and such. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think it's. I think one reason you see that distinction is I think there's a stronger distinction between professional and college sports, and I think that the economic motive of professional sports, at least in the 1960s as well as the 1970s, trumps some of its racial concerns. So they were much more willing to take on some of these boundaries and long-held stereotypes about athletes in the name of winning, because winning translated into kind of a direct result in economic success. The university athletic system is a little different in the sense that the university athletic system is devoted at least to two masters. At one level, it's devoted to winning in the same sense of professional sports, but it also has to do so in a way that does not offend its fan base, primarily alumni and boosters, many of whom who never even attended the university in their state. And so these state institutions have to appease their state populace. And so in these southern states such as Alabama or Florida, the state if the state was resisting desegregation of the civil rights movement, the university reflected that goal and in fact was steadfastly against it. And so I think that one of the things when we think about the civil rights movement, it's no surprise that the university was the location for some of the kind of dramatic events. We think of Ole Miss and James Meredith. We think of George Wallace standing in the schoolhouse door at the University of Alabama. These places are not unusual, at least in my opinion, if you think about the nature of the institution. That universities, we think of them as progressive and places of change, but in terms of their administration, in many ways they're conservative and they reflect the fact that they're funded by the state, and so they have to reflect the state interest. And so the public versus private plays a role, but also its location in the South as I believe traditionally kind of conservative institutions, at least at that period in time.
All right, I want to thank you again for letting us interview you.
Okay.
This is really great.
All right. I had a great time.
Thank you for listening to this podcast of the Florida Historical Quarterly. The Florida Historical Quarterly is the peer-reviewed, scholarly journal of the Florida Historical Society. The Society was founded in 1856 and is the only statewide historical organization in Florida. The Society is headquartered in Cocoa, Florida, and the editorial offices of the Quarterly are in the Department of History at the University of Central Florida. I hope you have enjoyed the Florida Historical Quarterly podcasts and that you will consider supporting future scholarship on Florida history by becoming a member of the Florida Historical Society. Go to www.myfloridahistory.org for membership details.